Welcome to the Professional Diploma in Web Development. If you've always had a keen interest in full-stack web development, then you've come to the right place. This course has been designed for both beginners as well as experienced web developers who seek a practical approach to web development. In this course, we learn all the fundamentals of web development and learn to code from scratch. We'll begin by installing and exploring our scripting environment, after which we'll move on to programming languages of the web. Now, this includes HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and even PHP. We'll cover both front-end and back-end technology stacks. Throughout the course, we'll develop a bunch of interactive web applications that you can add to your profile to strengthen your credibility as a full-stack web developer. From responsive e-commerce applications, style booking systems, and even HR systems, rest assured that this will be a hands-on course. As a bonus, you will also learn all about SQL databases and how to integrate them into your website. In this lesson, we tackle one of the trickiest concepts in programming, known as loops. In JavaScript, loops are particularly powerful in the event that we want to save time writing code, or if we are required to perform a tedious task indefinitely. In this lesson, we'll learn all about the three basic loops: the for loop, the while loop, and the do loop. And welcome back everyone to yet another session. In today's lesson 4, we are going to be covering JavaScript loops as well as arrays. And like I mentioned earlier, this can be a bit tricky. Now, without further ado, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. Now, our first topic today will be working with JavaScript loops. And essentially here we will simply just define loops, and we'll also have a look at a couple of examples of the different kind of loops. And this includes the for loop, the do loop, and the while loop. After this, we'll then move on to storing data in arrays. And arrays are really powerful in the event that we actually want to store a list of variables, for example. And then lastly, we'll wrap things up with a practical demonstration while coding. Now, before we unpack the actual content, let's have a quick look at the tip of the day. And essentially, when it comes to JavaScript, don't forget the semicolon at the end of each statement. I cannot over-express how important this is, because if we do not end our statements off correctly with a semicolon, then we tend to end up with buggy code. And now for our very first topic in today's lesson, working with JavaScript loops. Well, what exactly are JavaScript loops? Well, like most programming languages, we tend to use loops in the event that we want to minimize or if we want to reuse code. Okay, and this makes sense because there's no point in writing out the same block of code over and over and over again if you know you're going to be using that code several times throughout your script. Let's take a moment to have a look at some of the loops available to us in JavaScript. First, we have the for loop, and the for loop enables you to repeat a certain block of code several times, or a certain amount of times, and that could be 5 times, 10 times, twice. It really doesn't matter. Okay, and then next we have the while loop, which enables you to keep on looping through a statement or executing a block of code while some condition is true. Okay, and then lastly, we have the do while loop, and the do while loop is slightly different from the while loop in that it will at least execute the block of code once before looping and then check if a statement or a condition is actually true. Here is a typical example of what a for loop looks like. To initialize the loop, we call the keyword for. Now, this is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. And then the loop consists out of 3 or actually 4 components: the counter, the condition that's being tested, the update statement, which will either increment or decrement the loop, and then the block of code that needs to be executed if the condition is true. So let's have a look at how this actually all plays out. So we call the keyword for, then we set the counter of the loop. So the count would often be 0 or 1. We often refer to this as I. Then we test the condition. If the condition is true, run this block of code and then increment the counter. Now, this is quite important. If you forget to increment or decrement the counter, and if the condition is never going to be false, you are going to hit an infinite loop. And we'll discuss an infinite loop in a second. Now let's take a look at a code example. So here is a very basic example of a for loop, and this is what the output for that statement looks like. So essentially what we are doing is we are just console logging this variable I 4 times. Now let's break the code down. First, we initialize the loop by calling the keyword for. We then specify the counter or the variable I, and we set it equal to 1, we then test the condition and ask the question, while I is less than 5, do this block of code. And because I is less than 5, this block of code is going to run. We would then increment I, so I would now be 2. And then the loop starts from over again. And this is essentially how loops work. But don't worry, this is all going to make a lot more sense when we get to the practical demonstration. Now the while loop works slightly differently, but the principle remains the same. With the while loop, it's most useful when you actually don't know how many times you're going to be looping through some sort of code. The code will continue to loop only when the condition is true. And when the test condition becomes false, the loop is then exited. Now, very important, if the condition begins as false, the code will never execute and the loop will never be initialized. And also, don't forget to increment and decrement your counter. Now, if we break this down, we call the keyword while, we then specify the condition that we want to test, and then we run the block of code, and then we update or increment our counter. Okay, so the structure is slightly different from that of a for loop. So let's have a look at an example. Now in this example, what you'll notice is that our code is slightly different from that of a for loop. And this is the output we would achieve with this while loop. So let's break this down. The first thing we do is we create a variable called I, which is our counter. We then move into the condition that we'd like to test. And essentially what this means is while I is less than 5, do this, console log this, then increment our counter. So again, the same thing is going to happen just like with our for loop, and that is that this loop is going to iterate 4 times until I is equal to 5. Now lastly, we have the do loop, and with the do loop, this is what our code would basically look like. We initialize the loop with the do keyword. We then execute the block of code at least once, regardless of checking the condition. We then update our counter, for example, and then we test the condition. We then ask the question, while this condition is true, or is this condition true, then do the same thing over. So with the do loop, keep in mind that your block of code will at least run 1 time. Now one last time, let's have a look at an example of the do loop. And this is what our code would look like. And this is the output we would get if we ever ran this code. So first of all, we create a variable I again. This is our counter. We then do the thing that we want to do. So we execute the block of code at least once, which is console log, and then we increment our counter. And then lastly, we check the condition. So the condition once met, the loop will basically be exited. Excellent. Now there's one last thing that we must always consider when working with loops, and that is that we need to avoid infinite loops. And the reason for this is we'll simply find ourselves running around in circles, and this will most likely result in breaking our code and crashing our IDE. Now for our next topic, storing data in arrays. Firstly, we'll define arrays, and then we'll actually have a look at how we can work with arrays. And arrays are quite powerful when used in combination with loops. Now, what exactly are JavaScript arrays? Well, to sum it up, arrays are useful if you need to store a list of data where individual variables just won't work. And the difference between a normal variable and an array is that an array can hold more than one item of data at the same time. So you can even mix it up. You could have strings as well as integers or numbers stored in a list. You could then access that list to manipulate the data. Now let me demonstrate what I actually mean by this. So in this example, we have 2 snippets of code. And in our first instance over here, what we are essentially doing is creating a variable called myVariable. We've assigned a value equal to 15. We then update that value to 30 and then 89 respectively. So all we are essentially doing is just updating a variable, and this outputs 89. So it will not output 15 or 30 because the variable has been updated. Now, if we look at our second example, here we've created 3 different variables and we've assigned them a value. And now we alert and we get the output 15. The issue with this is that we would have to essentially create a variable for every piece of data that we would like to store. And that can be quite tedious. And this is why we use arrays. Now, how exactly does one declare an array? Well, here's a simple example. Much like with a variable, we'll call the var keyword and then we'll give it a name and we'll set this equal to square brackets. Now, in this instance, this array is not populated. So essentially, it's a blank array. Now, how exactly do we populate an array? Well, an array consists of elements and index values, or otherwise known as indexes and index values associated with certain indexes. In here, we've got a very basic table with 2 columns, index as well as index value. So we've got this array called myArray. At index 0, we've stored the value 15. At index 1, we've stored the value 30. And lastly, at index number 2, we've stored the value 89. Now, if we translate this into code, what we have is an empty array that we created, and then we've assigned those indexes with different values, with index values. And then when we alert, or we call an alert function on index number 1, this would output 30, because at index number 1, that's where we stored the value 30. We can do the same thing with a shorthand property. So we don't necessarily have to build our array according to the first code snippet. We can actually do this all in one line. And essentially, this is going to achieve the same thing. And then lastly, in our final example here, we have a blank array, and we're actually mixing numbers as well as one string. So we've assigned index 0 a value of hello world, which is a string, and the last two, we've actually assigned numbers. So if we alert myArray index 0, then we'll actually get an output of hello world. Pretty awesome, right? To better understand arrays, we can actually map out the architecture. And what we have here is a basic architecture of how you can visualize an array. And essentially, like we mentioned before, an array consists of indexes. So an array always starts at 0, just so by the way. Okay, this is important, not at 1, because this is how computers actually count up. So we start from 0 up until 5 in this particular architecture. Then we have index values associated with each of those indexes. Now, the length of this array is actually 6, regardless of there being an index 5 and an index 0. The length is 6 if you count from 0 to 5. Okay, that's quite important because we are going to be working with this in future. And then if we had to map this array to code, this is essentially what we could get. So in the first example, we alert myArray index 0, and this outputs the number 3. In our second example, we alert the index 2, and this simply outputs a Boolean value of true. And then lastly, we alert index number 3, and we get an output of apple, which is a string. Wonderful. Now, if we wanted to actually get the length of an array, we can do so by using the length property. And this is essentially called the dot length property. And properties are not something we've discussed yet in programming, but we will have a lesson dedicated specifically to properties as well as functions. So we can use the dot length property to actually retrieve the amount of index values that is being stored in an array. Now let's have a look at a code example. Now, in our very simple example over here, we've created an array called myArray, and we've assigned it some index values based on existing cryptocurrencies. And this includes Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, and Cardano. And then what we do is we alert myArray.length. The .length suffix is basically the property. And this will give us an output of 4, which is correct because if you look at our indexes, we have 4 indexes available in our array, or 4 values available in our array. Wonderful. Now, before we dive into our practical demonstration for today, let's have a look at what's coming up in our next lesson. In our next lesson, we explore the role of properties and functions, otherwise known as methods in JavaScript. Properties allow us to manipulate the characteristics of objects both in vanilla JavaScript and the HTML document object model, while functions or methods are extremely powerful for building reusable code to perform specific tasks. And now finally for our practical demonstration of code, and I think this is a part of the lesson everyone is most likely looking forward to. So without further ado, let's dive in. Now, to get started with this demonstration, the first thing I need to do is boot up my JS Fiddle. And if you remember correctly, the URL to this website, or our playground for JS code, is jsfiddle.net. So let's get started with a for loop. So the first thing I'm going to do is call the for keyword, which is our reserved keyword for loops. I'll set my counter to 10, add my semicolon, then add my condition that I'm testing, which is I. And I'll say, while I is less than 0, keep doing something specific. And in this case, I will decrement the value. So I'll say I decrement. And now I'm going to add the block of code that needs to be executed while my condition is true. And this is going to be a very simple one. So I'll say console.log I. And let's see what we actually get. So I'm going to hit run. But to actually inspect the code, or actually see the output that we're getting, we have to use the inspect element. So let's clear this up, make it look better. Run. And now we can actually see that our values are decrementing instead of incrementing. So we go from 10 to 1. And the reason for that is because we are decrementing I, which is our count over here. And this is how a loop works. It's going to continue running this block of code until this condition over here is no longer true. Great stuff. Now we can actually move on to something a little more complex, but still within the paradigms of a for loop. I'm actually going to remove all of this code over here and start fresh with a new block of code. So I'm going to create a variable called I, and then I will initialize the loop using the for keyword. And I will say that I is currently equal to 1. Great. Okay. So what is the condition? The condition is that if I is less than or equal to 20, keep doing something, right? So 20, and then I'll make sure that I can actually exit my loop at some point by supplying an increment value for I. Bring this down, and I can actually specify the block of code that needs to run while the condition is true. So if I modulus, now remember, modulus gives us the remainder after dividing a number. So what we are saying is that if I divided by 2, what is the remainder? Do something, okay? And essentially what I'm going to do here is I can actually just bring this piece of code up to here. Let's just clear our screen slightly. It looks a lot more readable this way. So if I then do this. Now keep in mind, our curly braces is basically meant for our block of code that we actually want to run. So if I remained at 2, if we divide I, because I is going to keep incrementing, then do something specific. And yeah, I'm just going to say something like console.log I, the value I, plus the word odd. Okay, and if this is not the case, then do something else, right? So else do this instead. So if the number is not odd after dividing it by 2, then print the word even is basically what I'm going for. So I'll say console.log, open my parentheses, I plus the word even. And I will go over this snippet of code with you in a second. Let's actually just write it out. Okay, and very, very importantly, I prefer that you just decide not to work through the code with me as I'm typing. Instead, rather have a look at what I'm trying to achieve and then rewrite the code. It just makes it a lot easier to understand. So even. So now what's going to happen is if the counter is at a specific number and we divide it by 2 and there's a remainder, it's going to print the word odd. If it's the other way around and we don't have a remainder, it's going to assume that the number is even. So let's run this line of code and see what we get. But before we do that, clear our console. And there we go. So we can actually see 1 is an odd number, 2 is an even number, 3 is an odd number, and so on until we get to the number 20. So we can make this a lot more human readable if we want to by just adding a space between our quotation marks over here. So I'll just clear my console once again, run the code, and we can actually see 1 is an odd number, 2 is an even number, and so on. Great. So this is just one way we can actually use if statements or conditional statements within a for loop. Excellent. Now we can actually move on to the while loop. So once again, I'm going to start afresh with my while loop. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an array. And I'm going to supply the list of values. And these values are going to be fruit. So apple. My next fruit is going to be orange. Also, never forget your parentheses, or not your parentheses, rather your quotation marks when working with strings. Okay, so the next one is going to be grape, and then our last value here is going to be lemon. Now you'll notice here that our array consists out of 4 indexes. Okay, keep that in mind. The next thing I'm going to do is create a variable called I, and I'm going to set this equal to 0 because this is going to be our counter. And now I'm going to specify the condition that needs to be met for this loop to continue. Okay, let's just break this off. So while I is less than the length of my array, which is 4, dot length. Never forget the dot length property if you are working with properties in this case. Okay, while this is the case, do this block of code that I'm about to write out, which is console.log my array I. Now the reason I'm specifying I here is because our counter is always going to increment. So we're going to loop through this entire array over here until we actually exhaust it and get all of these values. And now I need to specify my increment condition, which is I plus plus. Wonderful. Now let's actually test this code to see if it works out. So if I run this, I get apple, orange, grape, lemon, which is exactly what I want. I actually want to go through this entire list without having to create a specific variable for each of these. So for our last loop, we are going to be working with the do loop. So let's clear up our real estate. Now for the do loop, I'm going to try something slightly different, and I'm actually going to incorporate some sort of mechanism to capture data. Okay, so I'll specify the keyword do, which initializes the loop. And remember, with the do loop, this block of code runs at least once. And this is what separates the while and the do loop from each other, in that the while loop will only actually run this block of code if the condition is met. Okay, so I'll say do an alert, and I'll just copy and paste what I already have. So alert, you must be at least 1.2 meters in height to join this ride. And then I will create a variable after this. Variable user height. And this is going to hold the height of the user, whatever they decide to pass in. User height. Let's actually just remove this. And this is going to equal a prompt because I'm capturing user data. Prompt. Please enter your height. Okay, add a full stop. And now we are going to test the condition. Okay, so while something is true, keep doing something else. That's how you should be thinking about it. So while user height is less than what the user is actually passing in, which is 1.2 meters. So while it's less than 1.2, keep prompting the user and keep alerting to the user that they need to do something. So skip a line, alert, open my parentheses, enjoy the ride. So let's actually assess our code over here. So we are going to initialize our do loop. We are then going to alert the user that they should be doing this. And while this is the case, okay, keep doing this. Otherwise, alert to the user, hey, enjoy the ride. So let's run this and see what we get. So you must be at least 1.2 meters in height to join this ride. Now I'm going to pass in the value 1 because it's less than what we need to be in terms of our height. And then it tells me you must be at least 1.2 meters in height to join this ride. And it's going to keep prompting this to me until I actually pass in a valid number like 1.3. Enjoy the ride. So this is an example of an infinite loop. If we never meet the condition, it's going to keep prompting us. I can punch in 1. It's going to ask me again. I can punch in 0.1. It's going to ask me again. And then I can even punch in something like 1.05. And it's going to keep prompting me. Okay, so the idea with an infinite loop is that to avoid an infinite loop, we must supply the condition, or we must actually satisfy the condition to break out of our loop. So given that we know how to create loops the proper way, I think it's quite important that we understand why we avoid infinite loops. And I'm going to copy and paste the code I had earlier, which was creating an array called myArray with 4 items, index starting at 0 up until 3. And I created a variable after this, which started at 0 because I want to count from the first index in my array. Okay, because remember, arrays start at an index of 0 and not 1. I then supply the condition that needs to be met for this code over here to be run, which is while I is less than the array length, and again, that's equal to 4. Then do this bunch of code over here. Run this code, execute this block of code. So I'm simply going to remove this over here, my increment, because my condition is never going to be satisfied if you actually think about it. I will never increment beyond 0. So it will continuously run. And this is what we call an infinite loop. So I'll remove this over here. And again, this is not something you want in your code because it will most likely cause your system to crash. So just clear the space over here, make it more human readable, and I will run this code. So what you see happening here at this count is that this loop just keeps on going and going and going non-stop until the browser eventually crashes. I'm not going to allow that to happen because obviously it's a lot of computing resources. So I can actually just close this down and restart JS Fiddle. But here's the weird thing. Something else happens because I decided to create an infinite loop. So after restarting my browser, I expect some sort of abnormality to happen, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste the exact same code, but this time I'm going to keep the increment condition over here because we expect this code to run. It's not an infinite loop, right? Now we'll head over to inspect, jump down to our console, clear this up, make it look better, and we'll run this code again. And our code simply just doesn't run. We can keep hitting the run button, but our code won't run because we are still processing the infinite loop in this client. And that's the problem with infinite loops, is that there's no way to get out of it unless you actually specify some sort of condition that's going to be met at some point. Now this behaves differently in different browsers. So we can actually clear this up again, close it down, and we can head over to Firefox and see the different kinds of behavior that we can expect from different clients. And here we go. Case in point, our browser actually decides to crash. So I can say exit pages, and I'll head over to Firefox. I'll paste that same code. I'll remove the increment condition that needs to be met at some point, and I will simply run this code. But before I do that, we head over to inspect element, the console, because this is where our output is actually going to be, and I'm going to run this, and let's see what happens. Apple. Now we are certainly hitting that infinite loop again, and we can see that by the amount of output that Firefox is actually trying to process. Now the only way to get beyond this point and to actually sort all of this out is to make sure that we meet that condition. And again, case in point, our browser actually decides to slow down, and the only other option we have is to actually close this down to stop this infinite loop from happening. So therefore it's quite important in future to make sure that when you are working with loops, make sure that your condition is going to be met at some point. And that brings us to an end in yet another session of coding and technology. I do want to remind you that if you want access to the source code for the demonstration we had today, keep in mind that you can actually access them via the summary notes. I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.